So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first of 6 days, which are going to explore a little bit of the foundations of what, FPMT and Jamyang Leeds think is kind of helpful for you before we go into the basic program with Venerable Tarchin at the end of the year. Not that you have to commit to doing the basic program, of course, you can just do these independently of that. And nor are these essential if you're going to basic program. You don't have to do these 6 days. It was a way for us to kind of create some enthusiasm and some preparation for Venerable Tarchin, who, as we speak, is on his retreat after doing the master's program. So I'll explain a little bit more about that throughout the day. And today's session is going to be about the founder of Buddhism, Shakyamuni Buddha, and a little bit about his first teaching. And we're going to look at some points along the way about terms that we would come across frequently as part of the basic program in our study in general. And then some time for some questions, some time for discussion, some time for meditation, because we have to make sure that, the more that we study and the more profound our study becomes, because the basic program is one of the most in-depth programs we can do at FPMT. We have to make sure that it doesn't just become about, the details and about the study. It has to be about marinating that in our minds, meditating and changing the mind. So that's one of the dangers. To become more academic, it can just become purely that academic and not really touch the heart. So we have to keep reminding ourselves of that. So we're going to look at some of that over the next few hours together. And let's start by doing a motivation meditation together. As you know, with any Buddhist practice, it's important we start with a good motivation. So I'm just going to lead us in a brief meditation on Refuge and Buddha Cheetah. I would ask if you could mute your microphones for the time being, and then when we come to a question and answer session, which we've got time for throughout the day, we can, if you could save your questions till those times, write them down or something, or just kind of mentally remember them, and then we'll explore, have a discussion together at those points. There's one for each session. Great. So let me just get the technical things up and running. Okay, 1 second. So hopefully you can all see the screen here. These slides are often best watched on a laptop or an iPad. If you're watching on a phone, it might be a bit small, but see how you go on. So here's the verse we're going to use for the motivation. So maybe just find a comfortable spot that you are able to just reflect on these points together. We're going to do a little motivation meditation and a little silent meditation. It's important we start that way around, with generating the positive minds and then go into a calm abiding or breathing meditation. So then the breathing meditation also becomes part of the motivation. See? So we're going to look at two minds in this meditation together. Two very important minds on the path. They are Refuge and Buddha Cheetah. So Refuge is a mind that understands, on the one hand, the difficulties of human existence, unenlightened existence. It's fully aware of the difficulties, the uncertainty, the anxieties, the kind of being bullied by the afflictions, being thrown around samsara left, right, and center without any control. And it kind of owns that, it understands that profoundly. But it sees, the inherent flaws in the process. And because it's pervaded by, difficulties or dukkha, suffering, He doesn't just accept that. The man of refuge isn't just happy to accept that. He understands that the Buddha taught a way out. So it then turns towards the Buddha as the refuge, as the doctor, if you like, who can give the medicine for this. And one then develops a mind of conviction, or faith that we used to use in the old days, that word faith, that the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha are able to help. They're qualified to be able to liberate us from the suffering. So that's another whole chunk of study we have to do, right, to understand why those three jewels are qualified. We'll look at some of that today with the Four Noble Truths, the third noble truth, the cessation of the suffering, and the path, the fourth noble truth. So the real refuge comes down to us. We are our own refuge in the end. The minds that we generate, wisdom, realizing, emptiness, bodhicitta. We have to learn about them first from a qualified professional, professional in these minds, a yogi or yogini. So those two components of the mind of refuge, that concern on the one hand for the difficulties and sufferings of samsara, and a conviction on the other that the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha are the way out. So then let's recite those first two lines together. Let's recite them once and just think about the meaning. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. And the second mind is that it's not just about oneself. If we think purely about numbers, you are one, and how many other living beings are there on this planet and the universe? Countless, right? So these living beings who experience various states of sufferings, some less than us, some more than us, we actually have a close connection with these beings because we're talking about beginningless lives. Each of these beings has had an internet connection with us at some point. All those connections they have been our mothers, we have been their children. So in just the same way that we feel close to our mother or parent or guardian in this life, the same way, just because we can't remember, we're actually quite close to all those living beings. And we wouldn't want our mothers to suffer. If we saw that our mother or father was experiencing difficulty in this life and we knew we could help, we'd be right in there, wouldn't we? There would be no debate about it. You just go and help. But because we're talking about endless cycles of living beings and all kinds of various needs that they have and different karmas that ripen for them and different experiences of suffering they're going through, we need to have quite a profound level of qualification. We need to have quite an advanced technique, skillful means to be able to know when to intervene, what it is they need, how they're going to be able to listen. So the best way would be to become fully qualified ourselves. And that's all we're talking about with enlightenment. Fully, professionally qualified in all levels, all the techniques. You learn all the techniques yourself so that you can explain it to others. That's something we learn in the ornament module. So then the mind of enlightenment is those two aspirations, the wish to help all living beings by becoming fully enlightened yourself. So let's recite those last two lines twice, and then see if you can spend a moment tuning into that mind of bodhicitta, as much as we've got it right now. Yeah. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. So then let's just recite this next verse together. And this is, there's a whole host of prayers that His Holiness the Dalai Lama likes to use before teachings. And this is one of them. It'd be good if we looked at the others at some point, maybe in the next foundation day. I'll go through those because they're all ones that, some of them cover texts that we actually study in the basic program. So, here's one from the Vinaya, the monastic code, but it's also in another text which I forget off the top of my head. Let's recite this together. He who, caring with compassion, taught the holy Dharma so that all wrong views would be abandoned, Gautama, homage to him. So then let's spend a few moments doing a calming the mind meditation. So just find a stable spot that you're able to focus in for just 2 or 3 minutes. We'll do this, won't do it for too long. What I want to focus on here is, first of all, just checking the body is comfortable and is alert. And we're looking for a mind that's, on the one hand, still and peaceful and calm, and on the other hand is really sharp and focused and awake. Focusing on the rising and fall of the abdomen, perhaps, or the in and out sensation of the air at the nostrils, you choose. And just enjoy that stillness and that focus, that continuity of awareness on this object for 2 or 3 moments. And then gently end your meditation. Okay, are we all still awake? We're all still here? Right, so it's going to be nice to spend some time with you all, just reflecting, as students together about, the Buddha and his teachings, and little bits about the basic program. And I'm really happy that we make this, a conversation from time to time. That's not just me, blah blah. That we explore together what it is that you need to understand about these topics. You let me know. Because I'm not a lama or anything, so I can't read your minds. That's one of the things we have to aim for, right? Interesting enough, Atisha says in his Lamp on the Path that we can't really help sentient beings until we're clairvoyant. Interesting point, right? Because at the moment we're just guessing. We're just guessing what people need. And that's not good enough. We have to be able to be more precise than that. So clairvoyance isn't a big thing actually in the Buddhist kind of scope of the whole plethora of realizations. Clairvoyance is nothing. We've had it already, apparently, in past lives many times. It's not even necessarily a Buddhist thing, just a level of mind kind of being cleared by levels of concentration. So anyway, coming back to Atisha, it'd be really helpful if we understood what each other was thinking. Then can you imagine how easier things would be if we just knew what everyone what needed and what they were saying. You wouldn't want to know, I'm not sure. But things, from a spiritual path point of view, if a student and a teacher are working together, if the teacher understands all the karmic, baggage that we're bringing, and understands, what it is that they need, then it's going to go very quick, assuming the student is able to listen and take on the advice. But here we're just students exploring together using some outlines that our lamas have given us. And here we're looking at a course that Lama Zopa created with a whole school of Geshis. I think they got together and kind of created this program together, and it becomes some Lama Zopa's wish that FPMT provides quite a solid base of understanding in the Buddha's teachings as much as we can get. Now, in the Tibetan monasteries, where our tradition is coming from, the program of study is called the Geshe program. There are different levels of Geshe. It can be a small Geshe, as they call it. I can't remember the Tibetan title, or a big Geshe, or a really, really high level Geshe called Larampa Geshe. And the amount of study that they do is just phenomenal. We're talking about 15, 20 years. Memorizing, debating. It's quite a different system that we're used to. Usually we're quite sat here passively listening to someone explain, and then we, hopefully if we've taken it in, we can pass an exam. They do exams in the monasteries, but it's more about, they're tested in debate rather than so much about writing and tick boxes. So Lama Zopa here has been very kind, and he's kind of put together some of those important elements from the Geshe studies into programs throughout FPMT that we can do. And the basic program is and the master's program are as close as it gets to us doing Geshe studies. So, for example, if you did basic program, master's program, you could, reasonably say, you're quite a qualified Geshe. Of course, Geshis would disagree with that, because the Geshe degree itself only comes from a certain number of monasteries, and we're not there. But the equivalent of PhD, that kind of level, right? So it's quite an advanced level, and it's advanced in the sense that it goes into a lot of details. We know a lot of these topics already, like we know the Four Noble Truths, and probably some of us here have already studied some of Discovering Buddhism and maybe some of Foundation of Buddhist Thought. So we've already covered some, but it's just, what you've realized as you go along with the Buddhist teachings is there's always more layers underneath. It's like peeling away, and there's another whole layer here. And then what you thought was one division is actually the 4 division. Each one of those 4 divisions has 16 divisions. So it kind of goes into tiny little details. And the more precise and the more information we have, the more profound the more life-changing this experience of our spiritual path is going to be. Just by a show of hands here, it'd be helpful for me to know what level we're talking about here. So, how, for example, you could show by hands if you've done any of the courses like DB or FBT. Have anybody had some impact with those? Yeah. What about those people who haven't put their hands up? Have you had some teachings on Buddhism already? I'm guessing from other traditions or from other teachers, etc.
Yeah, I've actually emailed you a couple of times to talk about my credentials, but I haven't heard back from you. I don't know if you've got the emails.
I'm sorry to butt in. I think what's happened, Amanda, is you've emailed Kerry, and I only just realised that the email has actually come through to me, and I thought it was to both of us, so I thought Kerry had replied, but I'll pass it on to Kerry, and you'll get a response from us. So I'm sorry about that.
Just very quickly, what I've done is study with Sravasti Abbey, Venerable Thupten Chodron.
Lovely, yeah, very nice.
So I've been with her for 7 or 8 years now. So I'm one of the advanced students there now.
That's fine then, absolutely, yeah. Sravasti Abbey and the nun, the abbess there, is a very close student of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and actually they wrote together this fantastic series of books where His Holiness's teachings are kind of put into Lam Rim volumes, which is a really important text for us in the 21st century. So absolutely, yeah, you're definitely welcome on this course. I mean, as I say, these days are not necessarily about for those of a particular level. I'm just checking here what level we're all at, so I don't scare anybody. Anybody else want to input on this topic, or it's just helpful for me to know what we're looking at here? But it seems like we've all had some. Nobody here is a beginner, right? Nobody here is completely new to Buddhism. So I suppose that's where I'm coming from. Because it is in depth, right? This is one of the in-depth programs. So if we're a beginner, we might get kind of like a bit frustrated. I just want to make sure no one gets frustrated and they get the best out of it. Okay. So let's look at let's launch into some of the slides then. Well, these are a list of the foundation days that are coming up. This is day 1. Obviously, we're not all happening. It's not all happening this week. These are happening over the next 6 months, right? 1 a month. And I'm going to lead 3, and David Midgley is leading 3 to prepare us for Venerable Tarchin, who's coming in September. And obviously, I've had quite a close connection with Venerable Tarchin because, I could say that all the Buddhism I've learned comes from Venerable Tarchin's translation. Obviously, I spent some time with Geshe Tashi in London. I did Discovering Buddhism there. I didn't finish it. I didn't do some of the modules, but did most of them. And then I did the FBT course. And then went to Nalanda, the monastery there, to study basic program. And when I got there in 2008, they were just starting the basic program. So I was very fortunate. And Geshe Jampal, he was coming back to be online with us next month, actually, on Wednesday nights. He was teaching the basic program, the very first one they did at Nalanda Monastery. And Venerable Tarchin was the translator. So that was great. I spent 5 years learning with Geshe Jampal as interpreted by Venerable Tarchin. So I got used to Venerable Tarchin's style. And actually, at one point, I was even transcribing the classes. Over the 5 years, there's a few of us did it at different times. I think I did it for about a year or 2. So I got used to Geshe Jampal's teachings, but also the style. Each interpreter brings his own style to it. So we're very fortunate. And then obviously, I did a few years of the master's program and a couple of years of the master's program. And Venerable Tarchin was also the translator then. So, he's really highly qualified. Not only as an interpreter, you have to study these things yourself. And obviously Venerable Tarchin has passed basic program, master's program, but he's also, you know, as an interpreter, he's listening in Tibetan and he's explaining it in his own mind through, you know, English, even though it's German. He's explaining it in English to, you know, to the audience. So, you know, the way that he understands the teaching is very profound. So we're very fortunate to be able to have Venerable Tarchin with us, who I'm sure by now is already a Geshe, you know, in name. Two Truths and the Four Schools is day 2. So that is going to get quite complex very quickly. It's a bit like, actually, like the FBT course descends into quite a lot of detail very quickly. You think it's all very nice for the Four Noble Truths, and suddenly you're bam straight into the Four Schools with the Two Truths in module FBT. So it's a bit similar here. And it's important we just get used to that complexity right from the beginning. So Two Truths, conventional ultimate truth, and the Four Schools. Here we're talking about the 4 philosophical schools, not the 4 Tibetan traditions. So that's the Vaibhashikas, Sautrantikas, Chittamatras, Madhyamikas. Each of those has divisions, of course. The first one alone has 18 divisions. But, you know, we've probably covered that some already, perhaps, I don't know. But they are a way of looking at the view of ultimate reality, emptiness, some other tenets in there that they have. And that becomes an important topic later on for the basic program in the text tenets. I should say the basic program is a text-based course, not a subject-based course. You understand the difference? So FBT and Discovering Buddhism, for example, are subject-based. So there's a module on this subject, Discovering Buddhism, like, for example, death and rebirth, or how to meditate. FBT, there's a module on Four Noble Truths or bodhicitta, right? So the basic program does it the other way around. It says there's all those themes are covered, but you have a text which you follow, tenets text, or a text on Buddhist psychology, or a text like Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. The big texts are the Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life and the Middle Lam Rim. Those are the biggies. And then we have another text, Wheel of Sharp Weapons. We'll look at some of the topics later on in the day, but it's like that. So you still cover those same topics like Four Noble Truths, bodhicitta, emptiness, but you use how the Indian and Tibetan masters have explained it in their texts. Yep, the traditional way, right? Because you're in depth now. This is the advanced group. Don't get worried, but you know. Day 3 then is going to be about the mind. What we mean by the mind is we're going to be looking at the definition of mind. Some of the topics there will be about perception and conception, direct perceptions versus wrong perceptions, perception versus conceptions. Conceptions are mistaken but not necessarily wrong. Minds and mental factors. It's kind of like the parts, you know, of the mind, the psychology. I think Geshe in his FBT module, that's like main place it comes up is the psychology and epistemology. So it's the, you know, how the mind is divided and all the different categories, but then also how we come to understand, how we come from wrong views to correct views. You know, epistemology, how we learn, how we understand, how we know. That's important. But also about the nature of the mind, right? Its beginningless nature, endless nature. Yeah, it's module 3. Day 3, sorry. Day 4, the path to enlightenment, otherwise known as, anybody know? You have to unmute yourselves if you want to talk there. I think Amanda, you want to say something?
I'd guess the Lam Rim.
Lam Rim, that's the one. Good. Lam Rim. How many scopes are there in the Lam Rim, Amanda?
3.
3. What are they?
There's 3 levels of scopes of the lower scope, middle scope, and higher scope.
Great, good. John, what is some of the topics in the great scope? What's the main one, would you say?
In the
on the spot.
The aspect, the topics are what the actual outcome is.
Either.
So in the great scope,
Very nice. Yeah.
Practices,
Good.
6 perfections.
Very nice. Good. We can tell that Discovering Buddhism, that's why I've kind of just, where Discovering Buddhism is at the moment, is presenting the path. That's why I've suddenly launched into John. Don't panic. Yeah. Good, yeah. Looking at those, we look at the Lamrim text in the basic program, Middle Lamrim. Lama Tsongkhapa wrote a few different versions of the Lamrim. His great treatise is the Lamrim Chenmo. Chen is like the great, which is like, this one here you may have seen. The English translation is exceptional. And the Middle Lamrim for the small and middle scopes is pretty similar, and that it kind of, they're great, and the Middle Lamrims differ in their explanation of emptiness and calm abiding, mostly. So it's very exciting. You're going to be actually looking at one of Tsongkhapa's texts, which is really, really stunning. And day 5 is more about just some of the actual ways that we study in the basic program. You probably already come across some study techniques yourself, because you're obviously, you're probably better students than me, but just helpful to explore those together. Maybe we can share some tips together about how we study, that combination of preparing for a text coming up in the class, during the module, during, they don't call it modules, do they call it, what is it they call it? Subjects, is it, Lynn? I forget now. During this, Olga will tell me if I get it wrong. Olga, if you don't know, is the basic program coordinator for the whole organization, and also master's program coordinator. Yeah, sorry, I forgot, I lost my train of thought there. But anyway, yeah. I mean, we're going to look at things like charts, and we're going to look at things like, how to prepare a text in advance, what to do with the charts, how to understand all the language that's coming across, how to study in between sessions, how to prepare for exams and the quizzes, etc., things that come up. And we have to make sure it's not just about, as I say, it's not just about acquiring knowledge just for its own sake. It has to come from a strong wish to liberate sentient beings. This is not a worldly study course. This is a course of study we're doing to liberate all living beings from suffering. Yeah, so it's going to be, it has the academic element to it, but it has to have a strong motivation of a wish to help. Otherwise, it's not Buddhist. And then day 6, common terms and comparison of phenomena. Now, this is going to be quite an interesting one if we haven't come across it before. We'll look at some of the terms, obviously, throughout the 5 days previously. We'll look at some of the terms today, but to have them a day just to, or a couple of sessions at least, just to focus on those terms and make sure we're all ready for Venerable Tarchin coming in September. So then when Venerable Tarchin comes, it can go a lot quicker because you'll have had some information already. There'll be extensive notes that goes with each of these days that obviously we'll record these days and put them on our YouTube channel, but Olga has put together a wonderful set of notes that go with each of these days. Explain these in more detail if you want to read through those. So I'll share those with you in the chat later on in the day. Comparison of phenomena is an interesting one. It isn't coming up an awful lot in the basic program as a text, but it comes up from now and again in different texts. So especially important when we're thinking about emptiness, how does emptiness relate to conventional truth, etc., or what exactly are the things that exist according to the Buddha's view? Yeah, so that's going to be a really interesting topic to look at, just the last one. So for today, this is our schedule for today. We're going to do 10 to 11:30, the Buddha and his teachings. Session 2 will be 11:45, so we've got a 15-minute break there till 1 on the Four Noble Truths. Four Noble Truths being truths 1 and 2. What are the first two Four Noble Truths? Lynn, what are the first two? You have to unmute yourself, Lynn.
It won't unmute. That's it. Sorry, didn't want to unmute. That suffering is unavoidable.
Okay, and the second one?
And that we can understand the causes of that suffering.
Good, very nice. Yeah, very nice. Yeah, good. So that's going to be session 2. Session 3 then is the Four Noble Truths, number 3 and 4. Marie O'Deal, put you on the spot. What are the third and fourth?
It's cessation and path.
Cessation and path, very nice. Nobody's getting scared by these on the spot questions, are they?
No.
You just say if you don't know, because I don't know a lot of things, so I just say I don't know, so don't panic. And then the sort of summary and BP information in the afternoon at session 4, and then some dedications. Yeah, so that's our plan for the day. You got an hour there for lunch between 1 and 2. Then we'll come back and do an hour, 15 minutes together, and then just an hour for the last session. Does that sound like a plan for everybody? We can cope with that? Okay, let us begin. Oops, damn it. Just to say a word about preparation. You know, for example, when we do the basic program at Nalanda Monastery, sometimes we spend at least half an hour just doing prayers. In the monasteries, they can spend hours and hours just doing prayers before they even start. You know, for example, the Heart Sutra, you could do the Heart Sutra, you know, in a few minutes, you know, marching through it as our usual pace. Or we can do it really slowly, so it takes a long time, and really think about the meaning of emptiness and the conventional aspects. So it's okay that you spend a long time before you actually get to where was the kind of what you think of is the main point, because the preparation is really important. Which will come, you know, I've heard from a lot of teachers, Cheetah, for example, would emphasize that preparation is really important. Even if you don't have time for the main thing, it doesn't matter, but you're prepared, and therefore it means that just those little time you have left for the actual activity will go really profoundly if you spend time with preparation. Here's some words from the Buddha himself. Abandon negative actions. Create perfect virtue. Subdue your own mind. This is the teaching of the Buddha. So that is what we have to bear in mind as you go through these teachings together. By abandoning negative actions and creating virtue, that is like the Buddha saying, you know, abandon suffering and embrace happiness. Get to grips with these, you know. Subdue your mind so it's able to do those as you want. Yeah. So you could say abandon suffering and create happiness. That's quite a reasonable deal, isn't it? So it's in our own interests, you know, to understand the mind and create the cause of happiness. But to do that, we have to actually understand what happiness is. We have to understand what suffering is. When we get to the point of Shantideva's Bodhisattva's Way of Life, the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, it's a very special text. And there's some verses there that are really juicy to memorize. If you can memorize the whole text, you should do it, right? Or maybe a chapter. There's a lot of verses in there, but it's possible. And I did memorize some of those verses when I was doing it in Nalanda, and it's really helpful because even now, you know, having not studied at all pretty much since then, there's still kind of juicy parts of that text that really stick in my mind. For example, you know, although wishing to have happiness, they destroy it like an enemy. Although wishing to be free of suffering, they run towards it. Those kind of great verses of Shantideva kind of stay with you as you study these programs. And most people here on the planet are probably doing that, right? They're running towards suffering, even though they want to be free of it, because we don't understand the causes. We don't understand what exactly suffering is. And they want happiness, but they're destroying happiness like it's the enemy, because we haven't really understood what real happiness is. So this is what we're going to look at with the Four Noble Truths, is identifying, getting specific, working out the details of what happiness is and what suffering is. Understanding what the causes of those are. So we can then take back our role as the creator. We're already creating, we've been creating our own experiences since beginningless time, but we've been doing it in ignorance, we're doing it in darkness. So when, we just assume that things come from the outside, and we're blaming everybody else. We're blaming God, we're blaming the government, we're blaming so-and-so next door because the music's too loud. But we haven't understood the real creator is ourselves. So once we get a handle on that, we can take ownership of that. And then we can shift the balance so that we get the more of what we want and less of what we don't want. So it's great. We're in a win-win situation. And as our minds become clearer and happier, we'll be in a better place to help others. Let's take a look then at the very beginning of the teacher, the great teacher. Sometimes in the text you'll see the teacher with a capital T. And that always refers, it depends on the context, but usually it refers to Buddha Shakyamuni. And hopefully by now you'll think of the Buddha as your teacher. It's a bit interesting, it's a bit odd to say that, isn't it? Because he's been dead for 2,500 years. But, I would still consider my teacher the Buddha. And as we understand, more about the mind and past and future lives and what enlightenment is and what happens when we get there, actually the Buddha is still around. That particular, body and mind combination of Buddha Shakyamuni, born 563 BCE, is perhaps no longer with us, but that continuity, that mind is still here with us. So we start the story then with quite a privileged individual, a young man born into a royal family. Well, obviously, kingdoms, not like United Kingdom or United States of America, quite different in India at that time, small, independent little states, if you like. Born in Lumbini. Anyone been to Lumbini between India and Nepal? No? It's quite an unremarkable place, really. Quite small, but obviously has great significance for Buddhists. If you ever get a chance to do a Buddhist pilgrimage, there's these great sites you can do all around pretty much the same area. Obviously, the main one being where the Buddha got enlightened in Bodh Gaya, instead of Bihar. But it's not far from the border, from India and Nepal, relatively speaking. And there's many great stories. Obviously, some of them get quite devotional, etc. So it's difficult always to find out what are the actual facts, as in any religious tradition at these times. But one of the stories said that he was prophesied to be either a great leader or an enlightened Buddha. Now, obviously, his father was delighted. His father, the king, was delighted, thinking, well, forget the Buddha business, but great, he can be this great king and take over be a great ruler and take over all the neighboring kingdoms, be the fantastic empire of the whole area. So his father was delighted. And that's kind of where his father was then going to push, during his teenage, adolescent years, etc., that he trains to become the next king and become a great king, obviously. So during that time, he married Yashodhara and had a son, Rahula, and was taught all these things that were very helpful for a prince, or a future king, a future ruler, fighting skills, drawing skills, archery. There's all these kind of great things that as a prince he would need, and obviously he excelled in those. He was quite a bright guy even before he became a religious practitioner. in his late 20s. There's different ways of telling his story, but this is the one that, you know, is quite common in our tradition. This young prince had the opportunity to venture outside because he'd be kind of enclosed between these walls and everything was perfect there. He had no kind of reason to go out, but eventually he managed to escape this kind of boundary that his father put around him to protect him and keep him focused. Well, actually, that's probably going to work against his father's wishes in the end, because the more he kind of pushed and restrained the young prince from seeing what was actually happening in the outside world, it was going to be more of a shock and have more of an impact. So that's what happened when the prince managed to wander outside and escape the kind of palace walls, as it were. He saw these tragic realities of actually what happens, which had been shielded from and hadn't seen: sickness. He saw people in great pain from sickness, and that had been kind of disguised or hidden away from the prince. Old age, you know, he was only surrounded by beautiful people, young people, so really old and frail, he hadn't seen. So that was quite a shock. And then obviously the process of death itself, to see that would have been quite shocking. Certainly wouldn't have seen that as a prince. In India, it gets quite graphic, doesn't it? I don't know if you've ever seen, they kind of just put the bodies on a big pile of wood and they set a light and you all just watch the body being burnt, and slowly all these things drip out of the body and it flames and etc. And then they, you know, into the river it goes. So it's really quite visceral and quite graphic. So to see that would have been quite a shock. And then the interesting thing here that for me is always interesting is that at that point, this individual decides then that he's going to put an end to those. He's going to find the solution to ending those: sickness, old age, and death. Now that's quite a leap, you know, to get to that point from seeing those is just bizarre, isn't it? How did you get there from just seeing that? It's not, it doesn't even enter our minds. So it shows something special about this being already. We wouldn't even think it's possible, right? But here the Buddha, no, not a Buddha yet, here this prince is kind of declaring that actually he's going to free everybody from those. He doesn't accept that's the status quo. And that is going to be quite important for everything that the Buddha taught afterwards. Then he sees the wandering mendicant, a wandering monk. You know, there's this great tradition in India, still around today, less so, but still around, right? Of naked, sometimes naked wandering ascetics. Have you seen them? Seen pictures? Great sadhus, great sages, sometimes wrapped around with just one sheet, or sometimes all the long hair, the interesting piercings, etc. India has this fantastic inspirational history of these yogis wandering around, are supported by local communities, and seen as great sages, people who are abandoning, you know, the worldly concerns, if you like, or the worldly sufferings, and aiming for liberation and liberation, nirvana. Means something slightly different from the Buddhist point of view later, as we'll see, but the idea of liberating yourself from a worldly prison, a worldly cycle, was already existent, you know. And here the prince encounters somebody who's actually doing it. So then that inspires him as an individual to do the same, to renounce all those things that were comfortable and actually going to lead to sickness, old age, and death anyway, and find the truth to end it all. So this is the beginning of this prince's spiritual path. Spent 6 years practicing intensely in the forest with many masters. It's kind of said that the Buddha went to many different teachers, and if you look in the notes that we'll share later, he kind of gives you the names of those teachers and the different levels of meditation that this prince gets to. The kind of cycle is that he would go to one teacher and then he'd get to a certain level of meditation and realize and get to the same level that the teacher kind of had got to. I think this is great, you know, it's quite profound, these levels of meditation. While I'm in them, they're very blissful. But when I come out of them, I'm still stuck with all the aging, sickness, and death. It hasn't achieved what I'm set out to do here. I've still got the afflictions. I've still got the attachments, the cravings. I've still got, you know, the aging, sickness, and death. And you can't see that any of these methods are helping. So when he's mastered one, he says, well, his teacher would say, well, go to this person, this teacher knows a bit more than me. So then he goes on and he kind of goes through a series of grades like this, reaching these very high, profound meditative states, realizing that just that at the time they're fantastic. When you come out, you're still back where you started, near enough, right? So he's kind of feeling that this isn't working. So then he goes to an extreme of, and what do they call it? Self-mortification. I can't remember what the technical term is. Is that how you say it? Yeah. Where he kind of desperately looking for his answer, goes to the extreme of basically living, as they say in the text, on 1 grain of rice a day. Extreme asceticism. So it kind of now was swung the other way. The Buddha, at the beginning of his life, had all the riches and the comfort and the pleasures that he could ever think of, all the power, etc. And this time he's kind of renounced all that and gone to the other extreme, where he's basically relying on just 1 grain of rice a day. And he practices with these 5 companions, right, who are doing the same thing. In the end, he gets so weak that he's not able to continue. So it's not working. I mean, you can't concentrate, can you, if you're just starving, you're hungry the whole time, right? So he rejects that kind of extreme. And this is sometimes referred to as walking the middle way, abandoning the extremes. That comes up a few times in the text that you're studying in the basic program, abandoning extremes. And that's an important lesson for us to think about them. So then, fully nourished and back to health, not going back to the extremes, obviously, of his princely life, but not going into the extremes of kind of starving himself either. He then sits underneath this tree in Bodh Gaya, or pipal tree. I don't know how you say it. It became later known as the Bodhi tree. And then finally, he kind of, realizes that the solutions to all this is simply based on, well, the kind of the problems of sickness, aging, and death come from a misunderstanding of how oneself and all phenomena exist. And once you can understand how you really exist and how everything else is in relation to that depending arising, once all those things you understand are merely dependent on causes and conditions, and their parts, merely labeled by the mind, then the mind is free from karma and afflictions, is liberated. And combined with his great compassion, the Buddha is then said to have reached this peak of spiritual evolution, which is enlightenment. And then he gets the title Buddha, awakened one. It's a very special place in India, if you ever get to visit Bodh Gaya, with this great stupa there, a very special place. And this picture here on the right is it your right or your left? I don't know. Is said this is actually in the temple in Bodh Gaya. It's a very small room we go into right in the center, and this is said to be a real likeness of what actually this prince who later became the Buddha looked like. To be really close, the closest resemblance to what the actual being looked like. So then the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths. I mean, he was a bit reluctant apparently to teach to begin with, because he saw, he was quite advanced right from the beginning, and he could see how difficult it was and where most people are. And apparently this story goes that he thought, well, it's going to be too difficult, so I'll just keep it to myself. But then he's persuaded by the gods, by devas, that some beings only have a little kind of dust in their eye rather than, being completely blind. And if he teaches that, some of them will benefit. Of course, the Buddha always meant to teach. We're talking about quite a profound being here. He knew what was happening. But it's an important part of the practice that we are able to request, that we're able to realize the value of these teachings and make requests, so that we're able to value that sufficiently to be able to take it in. Yep, so that's an important part, is making requests. And then after teaching the Four Noble Truths, first to these 5 ascetic practitioners, who he spent some time with. At first, they were kind of think, oh, well, you gave up this practice, so we're not really interested. But then when they see the Buddha, think, wow, actually, something's changed. Or something is different now. He's kind of glowing almost, you know, said that the Buddha had this glow. And through the skillful means of a Buddha enlightened being, he's able to explain the Four Noble Truths to these beings, and they become his first followers. And then for 40 years, he teaches in northern India, explaining these Four Noble Truths in more detail, essentially creating a group of monks and nuns, a Sangha, and passes away at the age 80 in Kushinagar in India. So the other important Buddhist pilgrimage site, which maybe hopefully we'll get to visit at some point. Now, interestingly, what comes up in the tenets module of the basic program is that there are different views to this story, essentially, right? Was the Buddha already enlightened before he came, and he's just displaying these things to show an example? Or was this actually the case that he went from a prince to a Buddha in one life? That's something that you'll be discussing in tenets module. Different schools have different thoughts on that one, right? So if it's the case that the Buddha is already enlightened, he's showing these things for a very specific reason, right? He's showing that, you know, the princely worldly life, etc., wasn't the way. Extreme asceticism wasn't the way either. It needs a middle way of approach. Yeah. Or as His Holiness says, it might be more inspiring to think that actually he did do it in one life. You know, maybe that's more inspiring for us. So, you know, we can take it as we like. So here's His Holiness, quote from His Holiness. I feel a deep connection with Gautama Buddha, as well as profound gratitude for his teachings and for the example of his life. He had insights into the workings of our mind that were previously unknown. He taught that our outlook impacts our experience, and that our experiences of suffering and happiness are not thrust upon us by others, but are a product of the ignorance and afflictions in our minds. Liberation and full awakening are likewise states of mind, not the external environment. So the Buddha has many titles. As we go through these texts in the basic program, you'll see all the different kind of titles that awakened being gets. Sometimes Buddha Shakyamuni, right, from the Shaka clan. Shaka was his kind of family name, if you like, a clan name. Gautama is another one here. Interesting, you know, that His Holiness has mentioned here that things that about the mind that were previously unknown. So it's said that the Buddha's come at a very specific time in human history. You know, Buddha Shakyamuni wasn't the first one, apparently, on this planet. He was the fourth. But they have to wait for a time till it's most beneficial, so to have the most impact, karmically speaking, right? So that if a Buddha comes at a time when it's not specifically going to do much good, then, you know, what's the point? You know, might as well wait just a few years later or a few centuries later when it's going to have some real impact, and therefore the tradition is going to last longer. So the Buddhas are very skillful to be able to know when this kind of moment in time is. And that time for us was 2,500 years ago. We missed it by a little bit, unfortunately. But we're very fortunate to be still in the last part of this Buddha Shakyamuni's teaching. So as I think I mentioned before in Discovering Buddhism, it's called a wheel-turning Buddha. That's an important term to think about, a wheel-turning Buddha. And that's when a Buddha is showing the aspects of being an enlightened being. Now, as many people probably said that they are enlightened beings since then, but usually, you know, in my experience anyway, if someone's declaring themselves Buddha or Jesus, then you probably stay away. Except, you know, for Buddha Shakyamuni, because, you know, he was what's called a wheel-turning Buddha. He was actually an enlightened being, so he wasn't lying, right? So that's said to be a wheel turning Buddha. A wheel turning because he turned the wheel of Dharma 3 times, which we're going to look at in another slide. So here is the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. The noble truth of suffering, the noble truth of the cause of suffering, the noble truth of the cessation of suffering, and then truth of the path to the cessation of suffering. So you can see there, suffering is the last word in each of these sentences. It's all about suffering. Do you remember that quote from the Pope one time? He kind of, the previous Pope, where he said, you know, Buddhists are all just very pessimistic. Remember that? It does seem to be like that, doesn't it? Because we're always talking about suffering. Suffering might not be the right word for you. You know, it might be dukkha, maybe put it into Sanskrit, might be kind of allow more of a conceptual freedom for you to think about the different levels that that entails. Because even, you know, temporary happinesses are considered suffering. So therefore, the term might not fit for you to think about that in that sense, right? It depends, you know. I learned it that way and it seems fine for me, but maybe for you it doesn't. So anyway, the thread there is the suffering, 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 the truth of suffering, how that comes about, the cessation of the suffering, and the cessation of the path to the cessation of suffering. I wonder, you know, if you could put those in the terms of happiness, you know, the truth of not having happiness, the truth of the causes of not having happiness, the noble truth to real happiness, the noble truth of the path of happiness. You could say that, couldn't you? But there's a very specific reason why the Buddha taught it like that. In the Heart Sutra, which we often recite in the morning prayers, right, here at Jamyang Leeds, and the part of the basic program, maybe Venerable Tarchin will use that every time. It goes through a lot of different phenomena, different paths and different parts of the body and different parts of the mind, etc., and explain that there is no this, no that, no this, no that, no suffering, origination, cessation, and path, to kind of show that things do exist, but they don't exist inherently. That's something, when you look at the Heart Sutra module of the basic program, and look at a commentary, a Tibetan master's commentary on that, he'll explain how those things are, why it's always no this, no that, no this, no that in the Heart Sutra. But I'll just put it here because it's a nice way to just memorize those 4 noble truths. It's just 4 words if you want a quick way of thinking about them: suffering, origination, cessation, and path. Yep. Let's look at the 3 turnings then. Have you heard of these 3 turnings before? Has anybody not heard of the 3 turnings of the wheel? Silence. Maybe you all. Geshe Tashio used to say that if there was silence, you know, it means you understood everything, or understood nothing. I was usually the latter. So these are the 3 turnings of the wheel. Now, these are not necessarily chronological. These are just, although the first one is the first one, not necessarily chronological. These are more like subject areas in general that the Buddha was teaching. Right? First turning of the wheel was the 4 noble truths. Now, something I got used to when I was studying the basic program, sometimes things went very fast when we were hearing explanations. So I got used to abbreviating things, especially because I was transcribing. And I used to kind of put in little shortcuts. So if I put 4NT into the computer, it would then read that as 4 noble truths and put in the 4 noble truths properly. So I tend to just do that by since then I've always just put in these little abbreviations because it just, you know, just kind of gets things done quicker and takes up less space. You know. So 4 NTs, 4 noble truths, POW, not prisoner of war, but perfection of wisdom. Anyway, sorry, what was I? The first one, foundation of the 3 vehicles, 4 noble truths, but at the same time fulfill specific needs for Shravakas. We're going to come to that term in a moment. Second turning, perfection of wisdom sutras. I could have put POW there, couldn't I? Perfection of wisdom sutras for bodhisattvas. Third turning, more on the path and a different interpretation of the perfection of wisdom sutras. For bodhisattvas not yet ready for lack of inherent existent teachings in the second turning. So each of these turnings has a particular set of teachings associated with them, which have a certain theme, and were for a particular type of practitioner. Yeah, does that make sense? So the Four Noble Truths was the subject, or the kind of sutra, if you like, of the first turning. And that was specifically for this, well, it was for everybody, but specifically for the needs of Shravakas, which I'm going to look at in the next slide. Perfection of Wisdom Sutras is what was taught in the second turning, and that was about the lack of inherent existence. The Heart Sutra, for example, is a Perfection of Wisdom Sutra teaching, and that was for bodhisattvas. Other beings, could also listen to those and get something from them, because you also need wisdom realizing emptiness for any of them, but that Perfection of Wisdom Sutra is specifically for bodhisattvas. And then the third turning, in the third turning you get, for example, the teachings on Chitta school, which you look at in tenets, the three natures, Buddha nature, Tathagata Garbha Sutra. But then the Buddha explained what was a seeming contradiction, because you could see some people weren't ready for number two. So he said, well, in the first turning he said that things do exist inherently. Second turning he said that things didn't exist inherently, because there was different emphasis of different people. But then it seemed like it was a contradiction. So then the Buddha explained it for those who were not ready for number one. Oh, it was too easy for number one, if you like, but was too extreme for number two. So then he explained a kind of different version for those people and came out with number three, where he says, things do exist inherently in certain circumstances, but not in others, essentially, explained in the three natures. With me so far? So it wasn't like like a spinning the wheel, literally, like a game show, Wheel of Fortune, but turning the wheel. Those are the three turnings, right? So let's look at some terms. As we go through this today, we're going to look at some terms as they come up to make sure. Part of my goal in these BP Foundation days is to just give you some grasp on the terms here as we go through, so that if Vinabha then suddenly talks about hearers, etc., we know, we at least we can remember that we heard them once and can go back to our notes, even if we can't remember at the time, which is usually where I'm at. I will share all these slides, of course, with you in the chat later on, and also they're in the notes, which I'll share with you. 3 vehicles, 3 paths. A vehicle or a path, same thing, somewhere that takes us somewhere, right? Hearers, sought to realize an enlightenment being, sometimes called enlightenment hero, or their Sanskrit terms are Shravaka, Pratyeka Buddha, and Bodhisattva. Yeah, have we heard of some of these terms before? Probably. Yeah. So the hearer and sought to realizers, they are part of the Hinayana, or the individual liberation vehicle, and the Bodhisattvas are part of the Mahayana, or the great vehicle, or the universal vehicle, as Holiness prefers to say it. We'll come to those terms in a minute also. So just get in mind that these are 3 types of practitioner going for different goals in different ways. Yeah. Bodhisattva is aimed for enlightenment, as it says. The hearers and sought to realizers are not, they accept that it exists, but that's not their goal. Their goal is for individual liberation, and they have different ways of doing that. Hearer has a specific way, sought to realize a specific way. Yeah. How Buddhism gets to us is a really important topic. I just put down some points that I got from His Holiness's book. the foundation of Buddhist practice, approaching the Buddhist path, those Lam Rim texts His is writing. We don't have to go through all these because we want to finish by 11:30 here, so I won't go through all those now. You can look at those maybe in the notes as we go. I want to get to this. So Hinayana or Hira emphasizes the Hira vehicle, which is individual liberation. So it's you're hearing all these terms and it's difficult to maybe get a thread on these, but just by hearing them now and getting some grasp on them, we can get Venerable Tarchin to explain them in detail when we come to the texts. So when we study the texts, it'll become clearer where these terms fit in. This is often how the Tibetan tradition works. It gives you all the labels and things. You don't know what they mean. And then the teacher explains them later on. Like all the little monks when they're like 5 or 6 years old, they memorize all these texts, but they have no idea what they're memorizing. They're just memorizing words, But then later on in the debate class, it becomes, because they memorize them, they go, oh, that's what that term means. I know this term, and now I understand the meaning. So it goes quite well that way around. A Pali tradition is said to be the elder tradition. That's how the Buddha's teachings are first kind of written down in Pali, and then later Sanskrit versions appeared. Right? It doesn't mean that Sanskrit wasn't around at the earliest times. It just means that they weren't maybe so extent at the time. Different emphases again here. You see, right? Emphasis is on the individual liberation or emphasis on full enlightenment. Are we clear about those levels of different, liberations, if you like, or different third noble truths? Individual liberation is liberation from samsara, but you're not fully enlightened yet. Full enlightenment is full enlightenment, but it includes liberation. It's like the final stage. We're going to look at that in a very nice chart later on when we talk about the path. And lineage is really important because, to see how we connect with this figure who lived for 2,500 years ago, see how it gets to us. This is one way of explaining it. Different lineage can be explained differently depending on what tradition we're coming from. So different in, a Zen tradition or a Chinese tradition, or different Tibetan traditions would emphasize different masters. But, some of the figures would be similar going further we get back. Obviously, it all found have the root in Buddha Shakyamuni. So this is explaining our lineage in some way. There's lots of gaps here. For a complete list, obviously, you'd have to look in some of the prayers. Like there's a nice prayer in the FPMT retreat prayer book, which we used at the beginning of Lam Rim retreat recently, which kind of goes through all the ways different Tibetan masters till it gets to us, which is very nice to read through to see how it gets to us. So Buddha Shakyamuni, Lama Atisha, who, what's Lama Atisha particularly known for, famous for? Anybody?
Lamp on the Path.
Lamp on the Path, yes. Which started a tradition of what teachings?
Lam Rim.
Lam Rim, exactly. Tsongkhapa, he, as we know, is the founder of the Gelug tradition, which is the tradition that FPMT is involved with. And then his chief disciples, Kedrubje and Gyaltsabje, they become very important, as we'll see in the basic program texts. 14 Dalai Lamas, including the Great 14th. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, our current Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, is often considered the Great 14th, because due to him, Tibetan Buddhism was preserved despite the whole tradition being nearly wiped out. And then the great work he's done on introducing the ideas of Tibetan Buddhism throughout the world since. Pabonka Rinpoche and Trudang Rinpoche, his student, they're very important figures. If you've ever read Liberation in the Palm of Our Hands, that's the text that we always recommend for DB and FBT. Explaining the Lam Rim, this great course that Pabonka Rinpoche gave. He's considered a lineage Lama. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche, he's obviously a lineage Lama. A lineage Lama just means they've, ideally they've got realizations, but they've had they've been passed on certain texts and certain lineages right way back to the Buddha. Yeah. This is another important part that you come across, like the beginning of the middle Lam Rim, is this explanation of the lineage. Usually at the beginning of a text, masters will pay homage to where they've received the teachings from as a mark of respect. Yep. And this is found at the beginning of the middle Lam Rim. Extensive path. I can't see because my screen is okay. Extensive path on the left, profound path on the right. Extensive path being like the bodhisattva's deeds, etc., and then the profound path being the teachings of emptiness. So Buddha Shakyamuni taught these three turnings, and then he gave the lineage, if you like, of the Mahayana to Maitreya, who then passed it on to a Sangha. And likewise, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, those teachings on the profound realization of emptiness, were handed to Manjushri. And then Nagarjuna received those from Manjushri. So Sangha and Nagarjuna, are become quite important as we look at, for example, the well, all the texts that we look at would say that these are lineage lamas for those texts. These, when we see Maitreya and Manjushri here, we're not thinking of deities in Tantra. We are thinking of actual people. Yeah. Bodhisattvas, close disciples of the Buddha. Gets a little confusing here, but when we talk about sutra, these names are actual individuals. They're not deities in Tantra. Yeah. And then both those lineages are joined in a Atisha. So Atisha is a very special point in the lineage. Both those are kind of united in the Lam Rim teachings. And then Tsongkhapa, obviously, as an acceptor in how we get the lineage, kind of shows that those lineages are joined. In brief, that's the explanation of those. Okay, so that's the end of my explanations for this this session. We've got a little bit of time now for us to just have any questions or discussion on some of those points. Quite a lot we covered there. Basically, we just covered the Buddha, his life, his first teaching, spinning the three wheels, some of those terms to do with the three wheels, and then the lineage, how we get these teachings, how they come to us. That's specifically important for, authenticity, and also, the monastic lineages, for example, they have to make sure that they actually come from the Buddha. If you get ordained, it has to come from the Buddha. It has to come from somebody. Eventually, you should be able to trace it all the way back to the Buddha. That's the idea. And that is the reality, I should say. Okay, then, over to you. Yeah, Chrissy.
Just remind me, so the profound path is wisdom, is that right? And the extensive path method?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, all right, good, thank you.
Yes, so, for example, when you look at, there's 5 great texts of Maitreya. Maitreya, sometimes in the monastery they debate quite a lot actually whether Maitreya is a Buddha or a 10th level bodhisattva. I did hear His Holiness one time in a teaching saying we should think of him as a 10th level bodhisattva. I mean, from our point of view, it's almost like they're Buddhas anyway. By that point, it's just like one more step and they're a Buddha. So, they're not Buddhas, but, it's, from our point of view, they might as well be, because it's just, phenomenal. The things they can say and understand and teach, etc. So 5 great texts, and we study one of those texts No, we studied 2 of those, isn't it? In the basic program. I forget now. Ornament for Clear Realizations. We study 1 of the parts of that. It's a massive work, a massive text, but we don't study it all. We studied a little bit on, I can't remember now, mainly the 37 Harmonies of Enlightenment. And then another one is Tathagata Garbha, the Buddha nature text. So yeah, that's exciting. We covered 2 of those in the basic program. Is everybody here interested in doing a basic program, or is not everyone? Are you just interested in also? I mean, you don't have to do basic program to do these days. I keep referring to basic program, but maybe not everyone's doing basic program, so it might not be so appropriate. So do let me know if you're not interested in basic program, and I'll stop whittling on about it. But the idea was that these days would connect us a little bit about what's coming. Okay, any more questions?
It's not a question, it's just a bit of a comment, really. It's kind of useful. I'm sure everybody knows it, but it's useful to keep reminding yourself that the Hinayana path is inclusive to both the Pali and the Mahayana. The Hinayana is not Theravadan. Theravadan is Theravadan, and there's sort of Mahayana and those sort of paths, but the Hinayana is the foundation to both, where some people get the Hinayana and the Theravadan, think they're both the same meaning, but Venerable Chagron has taught that they're not the same meaning.
All right, thank you for that. Thank you.
Is that right? Do people
Yes,
agree?
the only tradition that's left from all the Hinayana traditions, you know, there's lots of different schools in the Hinayana that are existent since the Buddha, but the only one that's left right now is the Theravada. That's the only one that's practiced now. But you know, as we looked in the turnings of the wheel of the Dharma there, the Four Noble Truths, right? That applies, you know, to all the vehicles, all the schools. Everyone, even bodhisattvas, need to know the teachings and the Four Noble Truths and realize the Four Noble Truths. So that's something we come to in the Lam Rim, for example. You realize that the Lam Rim is very cleverly divided into these 3 scopes: the small, middle, and great. Yeah. But because you're practicing the great scope doesn't mean you can miss out the small and the middle and they're not important. You know, the main goals of those 3 scopes is different, right? So what you have to say is that you're practicing the practice of the small and middle scope in common with those beings, but you're a great scope practitioner, but you're practicing the small and middle scopes. But you're not aiming for future life's happiness. You're not aiming for liberation from samsara. You're aiming for full enlightenment, but you still need to do the practices of the small and middle scope beings. Well, maybe there's a little bit you could debate in that, but for the majority, that's correct. Yeah. That's something we'll look at in the day about Lam Rim. So if you look in the Lam Rim text, you'll see it when it explains the small and middle scopes, it'll say practices in common with the being of the small scope, something like that, in common with the practices of the middle scope, because you're not actually practicing the small scope being essential as a goal. Your goal isn't liberation from samsara. Your goal is full enlightenment. But you get happiness in future lives anyway, fortunately. And you get liberation from samsara anyway. Yeah. Chrissy, yeah, go ahead.
I've forgotten. What's the difference between a hearer and a solitary realizer?
It's to do with, well, you know, they're going to have greater merits because, you know, the hearer is working, it doesn't work as extensively as a solitary realizer. A solitary realizer does more practice and it takes longer, but the realization is more profound. And the bodhisattva obviously, again, has infinitely more merits than those 2. And their realization is for enlightenment. So obviously their goal is different. Their enlightenment is more profound. So they're working for different things. They get rid of different obscurations and achieve different enlightenments, you could say. You could say there's a hero enlightenment, a sort to realize enlightenment, and a bodhisattva enlightenment. Well, I've heard of that in texts. That's a common thing.
What would be those differentiations? So I get the one for the bodhisattva, but I'm just not clear about the first two.
Yeah. So it's quite a big topic, and that comes up in tenets. I don't know if I can remember it off memory.
Yeah.
Liberation for a hero only takes 6 or something lifetimes. Doesn't take very long.
Oh, that all. No
To
worries.
realize it takes a lot longer than that, and for a bodhisattva it takes a lot more longer than that. But what you get at the end of those goals is like small, middle, and great in terms of its realizations and its capacity, because of just how long it takes and what you're getting rid of. The way they practice is slightly different. Bodhisattvas are working for all. Bodhisattvas are kind of a very special, unique taste to their practice. They're working for all living beings, dealing with afflictions, etc., using those in the path. Might be using Tantra, for example. Sotra realizer, we don't have many Sotra realizers around right now. The money practitioners, like I said, Theravada and Bodhisattva vehicles, but so they're heroes and Bodhisattvas vehicles. The Sotra realizers are only choose to work when there's no Buddha around. When there's no Buddha's teachings existent, they choose to manifest and work on their path at that time. So obviously that wouldn't apply now because we have the teachings of the Buddha, right?
Thank you.
So there's more details to come with that in the tenets, and where else is explained? A few other places. Venerable Tarsh will be able to explain that a lot better. Anything else before we have a little break? Fantastic. All right then, let's have 15 minutes break. Come back at 11:45. Thank you, everybody. See you then.